So welcome everyone. This is our second YRSS.
You say ROUS?
ROUS. I have this shirt that has USA on it. It's a sailing shirt, USA and the sail number. And I look in the mirror, I'm like, what is this ASU?
Arizona State University.
Yeah, Arizona State University, exactly. Anyway, so we started YRSS, which stands for Young Researcher Seminar Series, a few years ago to highlight, sort of rising stars that, later PhD students, early postdocs, and we're very happy to have Kaylene as our speaker today, our visitor. She's been here, fortunately for us, all week, and she'll be here through Friday. So Kaylene is a last year, I think that's the term we use now, last year PhD student at UC Berkeley, working with Claire Tomlin and Jack Gallant for the intersection of robot learning and neuroscience. So we met at the Simons workshop that Anand was at this summer that Shiri ran, and we've been fortunate and we've been collaborating since. So, but very happy to have Kaylene at TTIC. So.
First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to try to share some of these results with you all. And I'm also just really grateful to have the opportunity to be here at TTIC and to meet with all of you. I've had really fascinating conversations with many of you so far, but if we haven't talked yet and you'd like to chat, maybe if you'd like to chat after seeing a little bit more about what I've been working on, please reach out. I would really love to talk to all of you who are interested. Cool. So the title of this work is Comparing Deep Learning-Based Autonomous Driving Algorithms with the Brain Activity of Human Drivers. So this is going to be a little bit more focused, I would say, on the methods and how I'm thinking about modeling this problem than on specific results. And if you have questions about any part of this, please feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'm really happy to have a discussion about how we're thinking about this problem. So maybe for some motivation, over the summer I had the opportunity to visit some factories that have been robotized in Denmark. So this, for example, is a picture I took at Linak, which is a company that makes linear accelerators. And the real situation of the robots in these factories is that they are doing highly repetitive tasks that are sort of part of this manufacturing process, and they are still in cages, right? They're separated from humans. And this has really been despite all of the really cool research that's been happening in robotics, this is still by far the most frequent use case that we see, where robots are sort of doing these repetitive tasks and fully separated from humans. But I also live close to San Francisco, and something really interesting has happened there in the past few years, where we now see autonomous vehicles that are actually on the streets operating fully autonomously. And I see them every time I go into the city. I see like maybe dozens of these in a single trip. So they're really all over the place there. And this is a really interesting shift, not just from the technological perspective, but also because of the fact that this is really the first time we've had fully autonomous robots interacting in environments that were designed for humans, performing a task that humans typically perform, and doing this all in an environment that's actually shared with humans. So it's really the first time, I think, where we have a real direct comparison or equivalence between these robotic systems and between something that humans are doing, and that is very important for human day-to-day life. And so I think what this really got me thinking about was that, well, what could we learn from trying to understand how these autonomous driving algorithms are similar to or different from how humans are thinking about this task of needing to navigate through an environment, negotiate things with other human drivers, and operate all of this at a very high margin of safety as well. And so when I think about comparing robots and humans, there's a few different possible benefits that we might think about getting from doing this. So one is that the differences might inspire more performant or more interpretable robot algorithms. So if humans are doing some part of this task consistently better than robots, then maybe that's a sort of a signal that that's something we should focus on when trying to make improvements. And one response to this might be that, well, robots don't need to do the exact same thing as humans in order to be performant. They could have different strategies for doing it. But something that's pretty interesting about autonomous driving is that it's not a problem that can be solved by robots in isolation, right? They also need to do this interaction with humans. And part of that process is it's going to be very useful to be able to make good predictions about humans. And so having robots that really understand how humans are driving is going to be, I think, pretty useful, regardless of whether robots are perfectly mimicking that process of how humans are driving. Another reason might be to actually go in the other direction, right? So maybe by building autonomous systems that are, inspired to greater or less degrees by humans, it'll actually help us then understand and model humans. To the extent that these systems are similar to humans, that maybe gives us some confidence that we actually understand how humans are doing this task. And that's really interesting to people like neuroscientists and psychologists who are studying things at that level as well. And then finally, the most speculative of these is, I think, something that is also kind of interesting and maybe a little bit farther out in the future, but really, like, what is the possibility space of intelligent behavior? Given that you want to be able to complete this very sophisticated and difficult task, what are the different possible systems that could actually accomplish this task? Do they all have to look like humans, or could we get very different systems that are still able to do this? I think is kind of an interesting question. Okay, so that gives a little bit of motivation. But now I want to be a little bit more specific about what exactly I want to compare here. So this project was really started because there is a lab at Berkeley, the Jack Gallant Lab, that collects fMRI recordings of the brain activity of human subjects. And they recently collected this specific data set where they have humans who are in this fMRI machine, but they're actually driving in a pretty realistic and naturalistic simulator while the recordings are being taken. And so this was the work of my collaborator, Tianjiao Zhang, who collected this kind of data from these subjects. And what this means is that we actually have access to the pretty detailed amount of information about the brain activity of people while they're doing this interactive task. And so I thought this presented a really cool opportunity to compare not just at the behavioral level, but actually at the cognitive or representational level between these human drivers and autonomous driving algorithms. And so the idea for this project is going to be to take this data that was collected from these human drivers and take these same inputs, these same images that are generated from the simulator while they were driving, and actually use that as the input to an autonomous driving algorithm, specifically a deep neural network that has been trained to do autonomous driving, and to actually compare the activations of that network. So it's a very, I think, analogous idea. So in the human brain, when you're looking at this image and you're deciding what driving decision to make, the activity of each of your neurons is some function of that task and of what you're seeing at the moment. And similarly, the deep neural network, its activations, the activity of each of the nodes in that network is also going to be a function of this input. So we can really set up a direct comparison between these things to really understand how similar are these representations or these computations that are being used to decide what the correct driving action to take is at any given time. But to talk a little bit more about how this comparison is actually going to work, I want to back up and give a little bit more context for how people have thought about making these kinds of comparisons with more general types of data. And so specifically, one of the most well-studied areas in neuroscience is actually the visual system. So going back to the work of Hubel and Wiesel in 1959, for which they won a Nobel Prize, they found that they were able to record the activity of single neurons in the brain of a cat, and found that these neurons would be very active when they showed a particular kind of stimulus, which was a line segment of a particular orientation. And so what they found was that these cells were very selective for this particular kind of stimulus in this particular location and orientation. And so we could think about if we want to try and then use this to understand larger populations of neurons, we could think about taking some hypothesized transformation of an image. So we have a particular input image here, and then we do just a regular convolution with some kind of filter that's expressing this idea of lines of particular orientations, so a Gabor filter. And then do some sort of nonlinear activation, which is just saying that when you are seeing enough of a match between the input image and this particular filter, you're going to say that that neuron should be highly active. It should be really responding to this. And so at the end result of this process, we get a feature which is sort of summarizing how active a neuron that is really responding to this particular input should be. And then if we want to really understand a bunch of neurons that are maybe selective for like different orientations of lines and different frequencies or locations, we can come up with a bank of these kind of filters, put them through the same nonlinear activation, and then get a vector of features that are expressing the general hypothesis that neurons are going to be responding to these patterns of sort of edge detections. So this is like sort of a hypothesis about the visual system as doing something like an edge detector. In order to actually use this feature vector to get some set of predictions about some specific neurons in the brain, we need to, we want to take the, for a particular neuron, we don't know which of these filters is going to be the most selective for it. And so in addition, what we're going to do is we're going to learn some set of linear weights that is going to be telling us basically for each particular neuron which of these filters is it selective for, or maybe it's selective for some combination of them. And so that's going to give us our final prediction for a specific neuron. And then finally, if we want to do predictions for a bunch of neurons, or maybe for a voxel, which in fMRI, a voxel is like a three-dimensional pixel, and it's the finest unit of resolution that we have for that modality. And so that's going to be sort of, you can think of this as something like the sum of the activity of something about on the order of 10,000 neurons that are all in the same area of the brain. And so when we think about trying to do predictions for multiple neurons or multiple voxels, we're just going to be taking the same set of features, but we're going to be learning a different set of linear weights for each of these to get our final predictions for each of them. Okay, so so that was all just for a single image, but in order to actually come up with this model, we need to have some way to actually learn what these linear weights should be for each of the things we're trying to predict. And so the way we do that is we come up with a whole data set that's going to be a bunch of different images, and we're going to split that into a train set and a test set. And so now our features and our brain activity are both going to be two-dimensional matrices that have images on the y-axis, the way I've drawn it here. And we're going to use these two sets of data to do a linear regression to get these weights that we say are going to be allowing us to go from the features that we're hypothesizing are capturing the activity of this part of the brain, and using that to come up with some predictions of the brain activity. And the way this works in practice is that we do cross-validation on the training data to select our regularization parameters for the linear regression. And then we try to predict on a test data set. And then we look at the predictions of the neural activity and the actual neural activity on those test images. And to the extent that those two things are correlated with each other, we can say that our model has actually captured something about the activity of the brain, right? So to the extent that we're able to do these kind of successful predictions, it seems like our hypothesized set of features are actually expressing something about what the brain is actually doing in response to these inputs.
Question?
Yeah.
Two questions, but feel free to defer a second. So the first one, really quick, the human brain features, let's call them the elements, are somehow dependent on the image, but we don't know exactly what the neural features, depending on architecture of your network, may be localized to this particular area of the image. Are you extracting specifically features which are global somehow?
So they are going to be specific to different parts of the image, and so, but that's also going to be true for the brain activity because, so like for example, the visual cortex is retinotopic, and so based on, if you're looking at like the center of the image, for example, there are going to be different parts of the brain that are going to be more responding to different parts of the image.
This is V1 you're looking at or something like that?
For example, yeah.
Okay, I see. Okay, and the second question, so you essentially, and I think you said correlation, and then you're looking at correlation. So this is a particular direction of prediction. You can also predict in the other direction, or in fact do something else entirely like CCA. So why is this direction chosen?
Yeah, so I think so this is like the encoding direction of trying to predict the brain activity from the features, and then the other direction would be like a decoding direction. I think the main reason is that if you're thinking about like how good of a job you're doing at modeling the brain activity, it sort of makes sense to have that comparison be in the space of the activations of the brain. But I think the more, meta or methodological reason is just that the Gallant Lab has like a line of work that uses this kind of framework, and so this makes it easier to compare to their previous results and sort of adopt their kind of methods. Thank you. Cool. So this is all just for example, doing this on a set of images. And when people have used in the past features like a set of Gabor filters, they found that they are in fact able to predict brain activity when subjects are looking at arbitrary images, especially in areas of the brain that we associate with lower level vision. So things like kind of doing these basic image processing steps. However, it doesn't work so well for areas that we associate with higher level vision. So for example, areas that we know become very active when you're looking at like faces or like objects versus natural scenery or things like this. And so something really interesting happened starting about 10 years ago when people started building these kinds of models with features from deep neural networks for the first time. So this was a paper from 2013 where they did this with a deep convolutional neural network and found that they were able to predict some of these higher level vision areas in the brain for the first time at a high degree of accuracy using these kind of features that had been extracted from a network that was good at doing object recognition. And then there's been a continuing to have work in this area. For example, there was a paper last year where they were doing this both in the encoding and the decoding direction, actually, where they were using the latent representation from a diffusion model, and similarly finding that they were able to predict the more higher level visual activity in human subjects. Okay. So, but we're not just interested in people looking at images, we're interested in this more dynamic and interactive task of actually doing closed loop driving. And to the best of our knowledge, this is actually the first work that has tried to do this kind of comparison with one of these closed loop tasks that isn't just measuring the response of the brain when you're looking at some stimulus passively. And so our setup is going to be very similar to what I was describing before. But now, instead of just showing a set of images, we're going to have the brain activity that has been recorded over time. So these TRs are the, in the fMRI machine, this is sort of like the finest temporal resolution that we have. So we're taking a new snapshot of brain activity every roughly 2 seconds. And then we're going to be comparing that with the activations of the deep neural network when we give these same images to it as input. So try to set up as direct a comparison as possible. And so in order to do this, we need to choose a specific model, a driving model that we're going to use. And unfortunately, companies like Waymo and Tesla don't just open source their driving models for us to try and do like the state-of-the-art comparison. But fortunately, there is a fairly thriving academic community that tries to develop these kind of models and puts them in competitions, like, for example, the Carlo Leaderboard Challenge. And so for this work, we just picked a model that performed reasonably strongly on this Carlo Leaderboard Challenge. It's the fifth row here, the learning from all vehicles one. After we started working on this project, it was surpassed by a few other approaches, but you can see that, for example, the route completion rate of 94% here is still pretty competitive compared to the other algorithms. So this isn't like as good as a Waymo driver, for example, but it's still hopefully good enough to give us a good sense of what the capabilities of these models are. And so this is the...
Sorry, it's kind of probably not super important, but do we actually know how well Waymo would do on this task?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think they've...
We just presume that they must be good because they're...
I mean, I think the if you stare hard at these numbers, you can see that, for example, it's making like this infraction penalty, or like infractions per kilometer. This is corresponding to, I guess, needing an intervention every, so like 0.04 would be, like that many kilometers.
And Waymo reportedly needs less.
Yes.
They what?
They reportedly need less. Who knows? Okay.
Yep, that is, yes.
But I guess you can look at collisions with pedestrians, those kind of things have to be reported. So hopefully it's not 0.04 or 0.02.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Okay. All right, thanks.
So this is the architecture of this particular approach that we chose, and I'll go into each of what these different modules is in a little bit more detail as I go through the results. But just to give you a high-level overview here, the idea is that even though this is a deep end-to-end neural network, it's actually split into these different components that have slightly different training losses during the first part of training. So the idea is that they train them on different objectives, and then they sort of, in the last stage of training, glue them all together and then do the end-to-end learning objective for the final stage of training. But the interesting thing here is that because there are these different modules that are trained to do slightly different things, we can actually not just say, how well do all of these, or how well do the features from across the network compared to the brain, but we can actually look at these different components of the deep neural network and compare that to different parts of the brain that have known functions from other studies in neuroscience. So this is just an example of what this neural network looks like on the data from the simulator. So in the top row of images here, I have the RGB image inputs. And then the second row is a semantic segmentation step where it's just for each pixel in the input images, it's classifying it as a vehicle, a road, a lane marking, or a pedestrian, or something else. And then that gets fused with the LiDAR input, which is shown on the right. So given the known geometry between the LiDAR and the cameras, you can say for each point in the input images, if it was assigned a particular semantic class, you can also assign the LiDAR point that same semantic class as well. So we get this kind of painted LiDAR. And then in the final row, it's using that painted LiDAR to predict a bird's eye view top-down representation of the local road layout around the ego vehicle, and it's predicting the locations of other vehicles, and it's also doing a final trajectory plan for the ego vehicle as well as predicted trajectories for the other vehicles. And so this is also just kind of showing a nice sanity check that in fact these predictions look reasonable on our data, which is always good to verify. Okay, so just a final few ingredients that we need to get out of the way before we can get to our final pipeline is just a few extra modifications we need to the more standard approach that I was talking about with the images as before. So one of these is that we need to have some additional inputs to the driving algorithm that the humans did not actually get to see. So the humans in the simulator, of course, were not looking at LiDAR, and we're also not looking at 4 different cameras simultaneously. And so we actually use the recorded state from the simulator and render these additional inputs in the format that the driving algorithm needs to be able to do inference. And this is kind of some information asymmetry where the driving algorithm is going to have access to more information than the humans had during driving. But it might not be quite as different as it might appear at first because unlike the humans, the driving algorithm only gets to see this current snapshot of the inputs when it's making its decision of what to do next. And so with humans, as they're driving through the environment, they're presumably coming up with some mental representation, not just of the current image, but of what they've seen over the past several seconds and using that to make their decision. But the driving algorithm is not able to have all of that temporal information. And so maybe some of this additional information that it's getting isn't so different from what might be going on for the humans. Possibly, it's hard to say for sure. And then another thing that we needed to do was to actually reduce the amount of features that we were getting from this deep neural network. So across all of the modules in the learning from all vehicles architecture, there's tens of millions of activations that we can measure for every single input that we get. And this wasn't actually tractable to store on our lab machine, much less actually do regression on top of it. And so we needed some way to actually get this down to a more manageable scale. The first thing I thought of doing was to just do PCA. So the idea here would be to take, for example, one of the layers of this semantic segmentation network, which has on the order of around 100,000 features, and then extract some principal components from those features across our data set, and then use those as the features to do regression against with the brain. Unfortunately, this didn't seem to work that well in practice. We were getting kind of inconsistent results between the different experimental subjects when we did this. And it also, we had to make a lot of decisions that seemed pretty arbitrary in terms of like which parts of the network we were doing PCA on, because we actually couldn't do every we couldn't do every possible component across all of the features in the network at once because we would completely run out of memory. And so this was it seemed like this was a part of this pipeline that could really use some improvement. And so what we ended up eventually doing instead was this idea called sparse random projections. And the idea here is that if we take our matrix of features from the driving algorithm from the lab network, and we actually multiply it by a sparse random matrix, so a sparse matrix that's drawn from a certain distribution, we can get a new matrix with a reduced number of features that actually preserves the properties of the original matrix with a certain probability threshold to a certain degree of accuracy is kind of the structure of this. And the reason we can get away with this here is that even though we have a very, very large number of features, the number of frames that we have is much smaller by comparison. So like I said, we have on the order of like 100 million features, but we only have, because of the limited data that we were able to collect from the humans, we only have on the order of a few thousand temporal points or samples of each of these feature vectors. And so the rank of this feature matrix is really limited by the number of samples that we have rather than the number of features. And so by doing this sparse random matrix or sparse random projection transformation of these features, we're able to get a matrix that has similar rank to the original one, but is much, much smaller in the feature dimension. Another really nice benefit of doing this approach is that it's quite fast. You can put this sparse random matrix on your GPU and just do the multiplication on the GPU right after the inference of the driving network. And it basically adds very little latency to what you already needed to do to get the features in the first place. And then one final benefit of this is that unlike with PCA, where we were sort of only taking the highest variance features and throwing the rest out, in this case, all of the input features can contribute to this final sort of matrix that's summarizing the original feature information. And so we hypothesized that's actually why we were able to get better results using this as opposed to the PCA. And then the absolute final ingredient that I should quickly mention is that because we have the driving network is split into these separate modules that are doing slightly different things, we're actually going to be fitting a separate model for each of these spaces of features, or feature spaces, and we're going to be choosing a separate regularization parameter in our linear regression for each of these. So the final form of the regression we have is like a standard, I have a mouse. There we go. We have a standard linear regression here, and then with a ridge regularization, so an L2 regularization parameter over here. But we're just learning a separate regularization hyperparameter for each of these feature spaces, and then we fit them all together, and we're allowing the final model to sort of determine which feature space is most helpful for doing predictions for each voxel in the brain data. And that's going to give us a way of sort of measuring which feature space is providing the best fit to each part of the brain. So this is what's going to allow us to make this connection between parts of the deep neural network for driving and parts of the brain that have different functions. Okay, so that's finally it for all of the method stuff. Any last questions on this before I go into the results? Okay.
Can you explain again what is the random sparse projection?
Yeah, totally. So with the sparse random projection, so we take our original matrix and we're just multiplying it by a sparse matrix that is drawn from a distribution over, basically it's like a set of matrices where most elements are zeros, sparse, but there are certain elements that are going to be like 1 over square root of a constant that's chosen based on like the number of features and the number of components.
So just Johnson and Strauss.
Yes, exactly.
So every element is independent.
Yes.
What was sparsity? So it's a Gaussian sparse matrix.
So it's actually
The non-sparse elements are Gaussian.
It's not a Gaussian one because the so I think I've seen it's either you do either Gaussian or you do sparse. I don't think I've seen both.
The standard approach is without sparsity for sure. When people think about this, yeah, okay, I haven't. So you preserve, you limit the distortion that
Yeah, so
feature
even though
you
it's
have.
it's not Gaussian, you can still show that it satisfies the Johnson-Lydon
Right.
stress. Yeah.
Can I ask sorry, one more? Can you go back really quick to the diagram of the system LAV, I guess? So is it processing each frame independently?
Yeah.
So it really is a sequence of images rather than a video? Should I think of it this way?
Yes.
So it's not like 4 frames stacked, so oftentimes you'll do like 4 frames, it's really just a single frame
So there are 4 images, but they're from different viewpoints.
at the same point in
Yeah,
time.
but it's actually a single instant in time.
Are you going to talk about the time issues, like what is the frequency with which you're recording versus?
Sure. Yeah. So I don't have like a special slide for this.
Okay, we
but,
can then do it. Alright.
Can you say again how you partition the features into these different feature spaces?
Yeah, so this was a little bit of a design choice where I was trying to do something that seemed reasonable, and the thing that I landed on was to divide it based on the training objective. So like I mentioned, there were like 2 stages to training. There was like a stage where each of these modules were trained separately, and then there's a stage where they're all trained end to end. And for each like intermediate training objective, I called that a different module. And so, for example, the semantic segmentation one at the far left here, this is a separate module because it gets as input these RGB images, and then it has as output the semantic segmentation. And there's a training objective on how good that semantic segmentation is that's sort of independent of what that is being used for downstream in the driving model.
And this sort of comparison is between, or this partition is for the reduced feature spaces after you apply the sparse transformation, which
Yeah.
then has to be same for all these trainings.
Good question, thank you for that. Yeah, so this is actually going to be a separate sparse random projection for each of these modules. Yeah. So the idea is that if we were doing it for different modules together, the final features we get would be mixing the features from the different modules, and so we do separate projections for each of them to keep it all separate. Cool, okay. So I'm about to show a series of plots of brains that look like this. And so I just wanted to give you an idea quickly of how to interpret these. So the idea is that this is a flattened map of the cortex. And the anterior, so the front of the brain is towards the outside, so the far left and right. And the posterior of the brain is going to be in the center. And then the color of each of these, I guess here it's actually a pixel because we flattened it, but each of these is corresponding to roughly to 1 voxel. And the color is going to be corresponding to the prediction performance on the test data. So how good of a job our model is doing of predicting the activity of that part of the brain.
What are the little gray regions?
Oh yeah, thank you. So these are the known functional regions. And so when they're doing the scanning for the first time with each of these subjects, there's like a standard suite of tasks that you have them do. Like, for example, look at pictures of faces versus pictures of buildings. And you use the patterns of activation with that to draw these little regions around different areas that have that are known to be associated with like faces versus other objects,
It's
for
like
example.
fusiform.
Yeah, exactly. So the one of these ROIs, which is I think might be.
This is specific to the subject. So it's for this subject.
It is specific to the subject, yeah. So that's also a good point. So most of the brains I'm going to be showing are actually averaged across 3 subjects. And so this is maybe like getting a little bit into art versus science, but our neuroscience collaborators have a way of deciding what the best fit of these functional regions should be, even when they're averaged across subjects. And so these ones are actually this averaged version.
So I've been told that there are many parts of the visual cortex that are retinotopically mapped. Are these all retinotopically mapped? Or?
So the ones that are highlighted here are, I believe, are all retinotopically mapped.
The white ones?
Yeah. Okay. So first up, we have the semantic segmentation module. So I guess I cheated slightly and already showed you a preview of what the brain looks like for this. But because this module is processing these RGB images that are being shown also to the subject in the driving simulator, It's not so surprising that this module is actually doing the best job of predicting the visual cortex activity. So here we have labeled V1 through V4. So V1 is the earliest part of the vision, and then V4 is getting a little bit more towards higher level vision. And what you can see is that the voxels that we're able to predict well with this part of the model are quite well isolated to this part of the brain that we associate with visual activity. So this is a kind of a nice result that's in line with these previous works that have tried to, for example, compare ImageNet CNNs with the visual cortex of the brain as well.
So they're lit up at the two ends. The regions go between. So is there some understanding of why they're lit up at the ends of V1, V2 rather than across it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a good answer. I think one thing that is a little bit different about this task versus some other studies is that we're not actually able to force them to look at a specific part of the screen. Because so typically when you show a subject an image and then try to like make predictions about their neural activity, you would force them to look at a specific part so that you know which parts of this like retinotopic organization are corresponding to which parts of the image. But what they found was that when they asked the subjects in the driving simulation to do this, they couldn't really drive that well if they had like their eyes fixed at a particular part of the screen. And so that is one, I guess, like slight complication on interpreting these results is that they're, even though this is like retinotopically organized, we can't guarantee they're looking at a particular part of the screen.
I don't want to derail you too much, but one more question. So this is retinotopically, V1 and V2 are retinotopically mapped. So presumably the fovea is somewhere at a particular position. Are we looking at a foveated region in the top and the bottom?
I think the fovea should be in the center. I'm not sure.
So that's where the action should be.
When you drive, you use your peripheral vision a lot. That's why they test it.
Is that a known phenomenon?
Yeah, like when you do the eye test for driving, they test the peripheral vision.
That's because they're looking for glaucoma and stuff.
No, but why does it matter? Because
I feel like I look at things when I drive.
You don't close your eyes?
What's your pedestrian collision rate?
Is there a known mapping within, let's say, V1? That presumably is trickier to map regions in V1 to specific retina regions.
I
That's
believe,
not.
I believe
you
there
have
is a
them?
map.
And okay, and based on that map, the fovea is in the center.
Yes.
And just to, so should we think, this is fMRI, right? So should we think of this as a proxy for neural activity? There are all kinds of concerns about fMRIs. What they really measure is the flow of blood flow to tissue.
Yeah, so our neuroscience collaborators are very careful to always say brain activity instead of neural activity because for this kind of reason.
But you think it's a good proxy?
I guess,
I mean,
yeah.
you're betting on it, basically.
You would have to ask the neuroscientists, but
Okay, so we don't, it's a mystery, I guess. Who knows?
Is there also any connection between different parts of the brain, like you label V1, V2, V3, V4 to different parts of the network? Or is there any correlation in the activation that you see?
yeah, that's a good point. I didn't see, I think I'll also show the different modules, but for the most part, it was kind of an either or situation where it's like if you could predict the models that we're doing a good job of predicting V1, we're also doing a good job of predicting V4, and vice versa for the, yeah. So it did seem to be sort of selecting for the visual cortex as a whole.
Yeah, big yeah.
Okay. So the next module that I wanted to talk about was this bird's eye view perception module. So this one is going from this painted LiDAR input, and it's doing this prediction for the top-down view of the local environment around the ego vehicle. And so the way this works is that it takes these LiDAR points and it sort of bins them into a top-down sort of spatial representation where so each point gets like assigned to each of these bins, and then you get a feature vector based on how many points are in each bin and what their semantic class is. And so we use the features from that sort of grid representation as well as features from a convolutional backbone that is taking that as inputs and then doing the final prediction of the top-down image as the module for this. And so when we look at the brain activity for this, the regions are actually slightly differently located in the different subjects. And so for this one, I'm actually showing the brains of the 3 different subjects separately instead of the averaged one. But the kind of interesting thing here is that we're getting activity in the somatomotor cortex as well as a little bit in the anterior of the IPS. And the IPS in particular is interesting because this is a part of the brain that has been associated, among other things, with coordinate transformations. And so one hypothesis about how humans are thinking about the local scene when they're driving is that they go from this purely egocentric view of what they see in the image in front of them, but then are using that to have some sort of internal mental model of what the scene might look like from a more allocentric perspective. And so if humans are in fact doing something like this, then we would expect to see this kind of representation in the IPS. And so it's interesting that there is, in fact, the ability to predict some of this IPS activity from these kinds of features. But I think also it's interesting that we weren't able to predict larger parts of the brain with these features. And so, this is it's pretty speculative. And maybe if there were alternative representations of the scene, they might actually be able to predict this activity better. And so this is maybe one direction for future research would be to look at different driving models that have different ways of handling this transformation from the egocentric perspective to the more allocentric perspective. Next up, we have a prediction module. So this is what's going to be computing predicted trajectories for the other agents in the local environment. And the structure for this is that it takes this top-down representation of the scene and it crops a little region around the detection of another vehicle. It passes that into a ResNet 18 backbone. And then the output of that is fed into a gated recurrence unit network that is going to be doing the final predictions for each point in time up to 2 seconds in the future. And so when we take all of those predictions, what we get is a set of possible driving plans for that orange agent there. So this was another module where the activations locations were slightly different in the different subjects, and so I'm showing the individual subjects again. I'd say the main interesting result from this module is that it's actually predicting some activity in areas that we associate with higher level vision, but specifically areas that we associate with perceiving other humans. So for example, the EBA is associated with being active whenever you're looking at pictures of body parts, for example. And the HMT is associated with seeing biological motion. So if you see someone walking, for example. And this is interesting because we've sort of seen from some other results, other studies that have come out recently, that when you're driving, you're actually representing other vehicles on the road as other humans, not just as from sort of a modeling perspective, but actually the parts of the brain that we typically associate with looking at humans are actually being activated by looking at vehicles. And so this is has some nice alignment with those kinds of results.
There's a fair bit of variability between S2 and S3. So S2 highlights HMT, but not EBA. But then that seems to be the opposite for subject 3. Do you have any insight into why that could be?
Yeah, so Tianzhao has talked about actually treating the HMT and the EBA, at least in the context of driving, as almost like a complex that's doing something quite similar. And for example, one reason you might think of this is that, when I said biological motion, I don't know if you've ever seen those video clips of when they put reflective markers on someone while they're walking, and if you just see the reflective markers, you can actually tell immediately that it's someone walking.
Displays?
I don't know if that's what it's called.
That's called
But yeah, so that kind of activity is something that is both activating your thinking of someone's body, but also thinking of it as motion. And both of these things seem to be active in kind of similar ways in the context of driving. And so there's kind of these canonical ways to draw these regions when we're doing these fMRI scans. But maybe in the context of driving, it really doesn't make sense to be separating them in quite that way or something like this. And then we have as well a planning network. So this is going to be doing something very similar to the prediction network, but now it's going to be doing this trajectory plan for the eco vehicle rather than just a prediction for the other vehicles. And the only addition to this part of the model is that after it does the first gated recurrent unit, it does a second one where it takes in a target waypoint to actually refine that plan to be towards whatever the current driving goal is. And so for this example, the target waypoint is going to be to do a right turn. And so the final plan that is output by the second GRU is actually going to be trying to complete a right turn there.
So you probably said, and I forgot, but the human subjects are given the route to drive, or told what to do at each intersection, some other form.
Yeah, so the human drivers are completing actually a memorized navigation task. And so they're actually being told, like, go to this specific location in the environment.
So they have seen that environment before.
Yeah, they've actually memorized it by the time we have collected this data.
But so the only novel thing that they see potentially is other vehicles, which are somewhat randomized.
Yes.
But everything else in the rest of the environment is the same.
Well, it is like a 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer environment, so they probably don't have it memorized on like a very detailed level.
Okay. But
yeah.
they have seen it.
Yes.
I see. And then they actually control in the simulator the
Yes.
driving. I see.
Yeah, so we get these target waypoints by actually looking at what the humans do and then pretending that was, what the intended plan was all along, so that the driving network is always getting the same sort of set of directions to like follow what the humans are doing.
Have you tried ever to show them the video of driving without having them control it?
Not in
Passively.
the fMRI scanner, yeah. Cool. Okay, so the results for the planning model look like this. So this is actually the one that does the best job of explaining activity across large parts of the brain. And in particular, it's doing a really good job of predicting activity in the somatomotor cortex, which is the M1 and S1, H and F. So F is for foot and H is for hand. These particular parts of the somatomotor cortex are really relevant to this task because they're actually driving with a steering wheel and pedals within the simulator. Or within the fMRI machine. And so those are the parts of their body that they're actually using to control the simulator. We're also able to do fairly good predictions of a large part of the IPS, as well as, again, some of these EBA and HMT kind of biological motion areas as well. And I thought, yes?
I want to make sure I'm looking at these heat maps correctly. So these are not the brain activity, these are how accurately your model predicts where. So if no activity was happening and your model predicted no activity, it would be bright orange.
Yes, that's true.
So before, I think our discussion about the phobia was a little misguided. It's not that there's no activity in the phobia, it's just we don't predict.
No, but
Maybe there's a lot of activity.
But if the interesting thing is happening in the phobia, you would hope that you would get some understanding of the interesting stuff.
But the computer doesn't have foveated vision.
Right, I realize that too. So what you really need to know is you need to track, like you were saying, track where the guy is, where the person is looking, and use that.
Add that as an action.
Yeah, so we actually do have eye tracking data, and one of the possible directions for future work would be to try and figure out if there's a good way to limit what the model can see to what the person is actually looking at that time, if there's a way to do that without perturbing
You
things
just
too
took
much.
the eye tracking data and added it to the predicting. Right, that would give you a map between the image and the eye tracking data would allow you to map the image to the retina.
That's true, but most of the driving network features are not going to be cleanly assignable to a certain part of the image, right? Because most of it is very far downstream of the input image. So maybe I think that might work for the layer that is right after the input image, but I think we need to do something a little bit on top of that too.
So I'm still a little bit mystified why you can predict the periphery but not predict the phobia.
Well, so one reason might be that the periphery is relatively consistent. So if you're looking at different vehicles or
It's
different
insensitive to eye position.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Question. So are we seeing training data or test data here?
This is test data. This is the prediction performance on the test data. I have just a couple more of these to show. So there's a
Just one quick
oh.
question about that. How, so you're not given the image that having a driver view or something, right? How is it possible that the activation of the hand and the foot get predicted correctly? Like, I just can't, like looking at the driving thing, how am I know like my hand and foot are gonna be activated?
No, but people are driving.
But the input is just images.
Input to the network.
Yeah, just images.
But this is
But this
part
is
of a
from
network which
LiDAR.
predicts how to press the pedal and
Yeah,
turn
but
the
I-
steering wheel.
I mean, the input of this algorithm contains like human trained data.
Right, basically.
Human training data.
It contains the targets for this prediction are based on people turning the steering wheel and pressing the pedal.
Oh, I see.
So, right.
So I think it's a good question because it's true that the neural network is actually, the final thing it's predicting is the trajectory for a few time steps in the future. So it's not actually doing like the exact prediction of the, like how you should like turn your hands to turn the steering wheel. So the fact that we are able to predict this is almost certainly because there's a very high degree of correlation between the like predicted trajectory for the vehicle and how you're going to move your hands to be able to do that. But I do think that's like a good, I guess like a cautionary point about interpreting these results is that all we're able to really say here is that we're able to do a good prediction based on this set of features, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the activity in the brain is like exactly the same as the set of features that we extract from the neural network. It just means they're highly correlated.
So, and this is like 9% R squared is like the brightest, right?
Yep.
So like how good is that? Like, and is it like, I mean, 9% sounds low to me. Is there
Yes,
just
it
like
is-
a
it
lot
is
of
low.
noise, or like is the fit good, but there's a lot of noise, or? I mean,
So this is pretty normal amounts of predictive power for fMRI data. So fMRI is very noisy, and also there's going to be a lot of stuff that's going on in the brain that is not going to be fully determined by what you're looking at when you're doing this task. You know, you could also be thinking about how you're going to structure your slides for your upcoming talk, or you know, all sorts of other things. And so there's pretty severe limits on what we can expect to be able to predict, both because of how we're measuring it and because there's a lot of other stuff going on in the brain. But yeah, this is comparable. Okay, so there's also a hazard detection module, this is like, I think, maybe a kind of strange artifact of like this very specific architecture. But it separately, in addition to the predicted trajectory, which in theory should include the ability to stop if there's an obstacle, it does a separate network on the RGB images and just outputs a binary decision of whether you need to brake or not. And if this module says to brake, it actually overrides the predicted trajectory. So it's sort of a kind of almost a hack to decrease the amount of times that the model ends up violating some traffic rule or doing something incorrect. And what we see with this is that the predictions are fairly similar to the semantic segmentation module, maybe a little bit more concentrated to the bottom part, which is corresponding to the upper visual field, which we unfortunately don't have like a super clear explanation for this. We have some hypotheses, but none of them are that great yet. But it's also doing mostly predictions of the visual cortex, which again is not surprising because it's doing some operations on these RGB images. And then finally, we also separated out the final planned trajectory and brake decision into a separate module because we observed that this improved overall prediction performance. And when we ran this one, we found that it was doing similar predictions to, or similar, the areas that we saw good predictive performance were pretty similar to the planning module, but not quite as good as the planning module. And then finally, when we put all of these together, we can, for each voxel in the brain, we can say which module did the best job of performing that voxel. And we get a map that looks like this, where similar to what we saw with the individual modules, the semantic segmentation and the hazard detection are pretty localized to the visual cortex, whereas the planning and control modules are explaining a lot more of the somatomotor cortex, as well as some higher level vision areas that we're associating with perceiving other agents and reasoning about other agents.